Um, there were they were still a force, workers were still a force in local politics, but generally within their neighborhoods rather than in the city as a whole. Now, skilled workers, the iron foundry workers, or at least the younger generation that had been worked for Scranton, did not suffer in the long run. The newer, more technologically sophisticated machinery used in industrial production required skilled workers who could run and repair the machinery. And as industry expanded across the nation, the demand for skilled labor, for skilled workers, increased, and their wages increased. And they, as a group and as individuals, were able to benefit immensely from the new industrial order. So the workers who had been protesting in the 1870s and early 1880s, by the end of the 80s and into the 1890s, they or their sons are the beneficiaries of this industrialization. Now, average real wages rose over 100% between 1876 and 1896. They doubled, in other words, real wages. But skilled workers saw their wages increase by 150%. Wages for the unskilled rose only 30%. So wages for everybody's rising, but it's rising for those who are better placed at a higher and faster rate than it is for those who are at the bottom. There's also a greater separation between the best paid workers and the lowest paid workers. But it's important to keep in mind that it's all in a context of everybody's getting more money. It's just those who have more get even more than anybody else. So American workers were making more money, and they were beginning to enjoy more material comforts than they had previously, but the disparity between workers increased, and differences were increasingly marked along racial and ethnic lines. So a segmented job market developed, particularly through the 1880s and 1890s, with native-born Americans, typically of older stock, British, Dutch, maybe, French Huguenot, some Germans, were occupying the better-paid, skilled jobs, while immigrants held the worst-paying and most dangerous positions. And while both groups were white, there was a clear-cut division that to be American meant having both prestige and money and a lifestyle that was similar to that of the middle class. To be a worker meant that you were a foreigner and not competent to do the high-quality, better-paid work reserved for Americans. By 1900, this had become the norm throughout the country, with the exception of the South, where there was not very much immigration. In the South, industrial development was at a much lower rate, and typically unskilled jobs were done either by African Americans or by poor whites who could no longer make it in the country as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and who then migrated to the cities in search of employment. In either case, the Southern case, where poor whites and African Americans did the lower-end labor, or in the North, the Midwest and the West, where immigrant workers did the lower-end labor. The unskilled labor was marked as culturally inferior, and the person doing unskilled labor was often talked about as incapable of doing anything better with his life. I use the male pronoun there on purpose. If unskilled workers lived in misery, it was due to their own inadequacies. And they had simply brought their misery with them when they migrated to America from Europe or left the farm down south. This was the beginning of the way in which ethno-racial ideas are beginning to reshape the labor market in a way that transforms the labor issues into, or class issues, into ethno-racial issues. So, in the 1890s, 40%, let's see. Oh, I see. That might be kind of hard to read, but can you? White on yellow. It's not a good choice, but you'll get it. So, the middle class, which is both a combination of the commercial class and professionals, was about 15% of the total population. Farm families were about 40% at this time. And the working class, what we'll call the urban working class, but that could mean workers in places like Stockton, as well as places like San Francisco, made up about 45% of the population, total population. I'm not going to talk about the farm families right now because that's a more complicated story, and to some degree was kept separated from the labor question. So if we look at the bottom 45%, the working class, and that's how they were generally referred to themselves and were referred to. We have a breakdown, which will go from bottom first up. So 15% were in the skilled and were considered skilled workers, and these would be generally old stock Americans who made $800 to $1,500 a year. A middle class professional was likely to make between $1,200 and $3,000 a year. So there's some overlap, but there's still a distinction. Semi-skilled workers were approximately 45% of the working class population, and then the unskilled were 40%. So let's talk about the unskilled first, the people who made less than $500 a year. Which was $500 is a critical term because the government in 1890 determined that was the minimum necessary to support a family of 5 with an adequate diet. If you if you made less than $500, you better not have more than 3 children. But unfortunately, you were probably likely to have 5 to 10 children. So the identity of unskilled workers was first and foremost a question of struggling to survive, because you don't even make the amount of money you need to in order to eat. Now, we're talking in terms of male income. So if you did not have others to rely on, you and yours were likely to die. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean that literally. You would die of starvation, you would catch a cold, and it would quickly turn to pneumonia, and you'd be dead. Your children, half of them, would not make it to adulthood. If you did not have family you could turn to, or an ethnic group, or a church group, you essentially were doomed. And you and yours bore the brunt of the unpredictability that was inherent to industrial development and the restructuring of world markets that was underway in the 19th century. So family was extremely important, well, for everybody, but particularly for the group at the bottom, And ethnic identity was particularly important. But they were not questions of simply or even primarily having to do with heritage. Family and church were both networks that stretched back to your home village or region, and they provided the only safety net that you had, the only people that you could call on when you needed money that you didn't have in order to get through the next crisis, or in order to get a job. And this reinforced ethnic and racial ties. In each major city, particular jobs in given industries were owned by different ethnic groups. Now, this had little to do with the skills or the cultural background that an immigrant group brought to America. And historians like John Bodner, who I think I asked you to read something by him, who have compared the histories of immigrant groups brought to America across different cities, have found that Italians, blacks, and Poles divided up the job market one way in Pittsburgh, a very different way in Cleveland, and yet a third way in Chicago. This division was largely accidental. Once an ethnic group established itself in a job category, they held on to it, and they held on to it fiercely. They protected themselves and their control of that job category with violence, if necessary, against other ethnic groups trying to break into it, and even more violently against firms that sought to lower wages even further by bringing in another nationality to replace them. So interethnic conflict inevitably surrounded strikes and involved fighting between different neighborhoods. One of the well-studied examples are the battles between Irish and Chinese workers in San Francisco fighting over the control of ditch-digging jobs and streetcar line construction in the 1870s and 1880s. But there's also a very well-documented study of the deadly battles that led to quite many deaths between Norwegian and Swedish workers fighting over control of Teamster jobs in the Duluth and Fargo areas. From our perspective, from a distant perspective, the difference between a Swedish and a Norwegian worker probably is pretty fuzzy. To the Norwegians and the Swedes, it was pretty important, but it didn't have to do about even blood ties so much as control over employment possibilities. And what families were going to be able to get employment in which positions. So group loyalty was essential, and it trumped all other ties. Studies of American workers in the 19th century suggest that most workers seldom, now we're talking about urban workers, remember, seldom if ever worked with people outside their racial or ethnic group. And photographs and paintings from the period do seem to back